Welcome to this episode of Men Who Understood the Times. I'm Michael with Josh and Andy. We're going to start with the drinks tonight. So, Andy, what are you drinking tonight?
I am a man of routine. I've got highball, brandy, and ginger ale.
Out in the 50-degree weather of Las Vegas.
It's a
Josh,
dry cold. It's
it's a
a
dry.
dry cold. I keep telling you.
Yeah. Josh, I know it's cold and you got lots of snow there the last 2 days. So, what are you drinking in the cold and snow?
I am drinking a Milwaukee brewery. This is Third Space. Heavenly Haze is a hazy IPA.
All right.
So, yeah.
I went with a salted watermelon whiskey from Old Smoky. And my wife had come by before. She says, "What are you drinking?" And then she tastes this. That is really good. So yeah, that's why I'm drinking it tonight.
Watermelon.
Watermelon whiskey. Yeah, salted watermelon whiskey. And then the disclaimer. And with this disclaimer, it's not just, three guys are talking, but this one we're going to be talking about vaccines. And some will say, why are two pastors and a high school teacher able to talk about vaccines? And there I think of when I was presenting my book at a pastor's conference, and there's some things about masks and social distancing and the COVID-19 vaccination in there. And the pastors asked me that. And my response was, why can I talk about this? I said, I can read, because I did a lot of research. And there I think of, if you know who Cheryl Hines is, if you don't know who she is, well, she's the wife of RFK Jr., who is the Secretary of Health and Human Services. So RFK Jr.'s wife Cheryl was on The View, and I know you guys are probably regular watchers of The View. And the ladies there were challenging her, saying, "Well, how can RFK Jr. be the head of Health and Human Services if he's not a doctor?" And then she replied that, quote, "and the majority of secretaries of HHS have not been doctors." And then later on, she pressed them and said, "President Obama's HHS secretary was an economist." Okay. But I can't think of anyone who knows more about these kinds of things than someone like RFK Jr. because he's been studying these kinds of things for a long time. So, what do you guys want to add to that of why we can be talking about something like vaccines? Andy, if you want to go.
I'll speak to that.
Okay, or
Oh,
Josh.
I think this falls into the category of stewardship. Um, Stewardship about the things that we intentionally expose our wives and children to. And if you are not going to become well versed on this enough to make a decision about it, one way or the other, then you're just relying on the quote unquote experts. And if there's one takeaway that I have from the entire COVID experience, it's that experts have political motivations and have no qualms about being massively dishonest to us. How many times were we lied to in so many realms in the entire COVID saga? Um, and I will say it's extremely difficult to tell fact from fiction on this, which makes, I think, a little bit of forgivability, or you can give yourself some grace for being confused. And what's interesting is when people see the tagline for this, it can't not be polemic, right? It's gonna be political immediately. Like, oh, these guys are right wingers because they're talking about vaccines. Or if we're in support of vaccines that we're left wing, consider why does it break down on political lines? Isn't that interesting? You don't do that for cancer research, right? No one's talking about like breast cancer screenings or getting your prostate checked on red and blue political lines. But it is for this, which means that there's something else happening here underneath that's a motivation. And this is something that you can't trust the medical experts for because they have ulterior motives. I'm not even sure what they are. But it is really, really important for people like pastors and teachers and lawyers and construction workers and whatever else to read about these things because you could be doing irreversible damage to your body or that of your family.
And so what you were saying too there about red and blue, Democrat and Republican, if people are paying attention to this, that the people that were all about the body and vaccines and things like that and against big pharma were the Democrats, the left. And that was only a decade or two ago. And then, yes, things switched. And so now supposedly the body, your health, what you're putting in your body, that's now a right-wing thing. It should be a Christian thing. I'm very careful about, the things that are important to me. Like if it's my vehicle, this is one of the most expensive things I have. I'm going to make sure that I put the right oil in and the right gas in and so forth. If I'm going to, my bike, I want to make sure I put the best materials on my bike or in my bike. Well, my body is God's gift to me, so I want to make sure that what I'm put into my body. Uh, Andy, what do you want to say about this of why you can talk on vaccines?
Well, I just what I would lead with is I don't have any weight or authority to talk on it. We're just riffing,
Yep.
but we talk about things that are relevant concerns. And when it comes to this subject matter, if one of our target audiences, which it is young Christian men who are wrestling with the issues of our day, you better believe that if you want to have a family someday, you're going to need to have Christian sanctified reason exercised in the decisions that come into play with your children. So that's by and large number one, and why I think that uh, maybe we can just contribute to the conversation or the discussion a little bit here, even if we don't make any, blanket dictums. The other thing is that I'm sure somebody wrote a book with this title, but you guys probably have to tell me what it is. But the lies we believe, right? The lies we believe. I think we've come to a unique and at times precarious place in our culture when we, as American citizens, much less Christian Americans, assume that the government has carte blanche to tell us almost from a moral high tower what we can and cannot do with our body or with our bodies. And I just think that that deserves some scrutiny. And then lastly, I I feel like I, in particular, given my type 1 diabetes, but perhaps you gentlemen also anecdotally from your ministry experiences, have some anecdotes to share simply for the sake of perspective.
Yeah, and I think a big thing is uh, looking at the worldview of people that people are saying with experts, trust the experts. I had written in my book about for some reason in the last number of years we have fallen into this idea of expertism. That we have to trust this expert or that expert, as opposed to like when I was growing up, that you look to someone who had a lot of worldly knowledge, all kinds of things. Someone who was a jack of all trades. But that's not the way we are now. We have to be specialized in things. And then again, like the worldview, why should I trust someone like big pharma or politicians or companies or uh, so-called experts who are pushing all these kinds of things, but at the same time, they are the ones who are all for transgenderism and transgender surgeries. They are for abortion and using aborted cells in these things. Uh, they have a different worldview than I do, well, than any of us do. And so that makes it suspect right away. So, Josh, what about uh, issues with vaccine? I know you wanted to talk specifically with, say, hepatitis B.
Sure. If I could just
Mhm.
uh, piggyback on your last point there for a second. If you if you steel man the argument that you're not allowed to have or espouse an opinion about X, Y, and Z topic unless you are a content expert in that topic. Um, okay, if you take that to its logical extreme, um, uh, you get Ketanji Brown Jackson, who was asked if she could define what a woman is in the context of law, and and she said, "No, I'm not a biologist, and so I can't define that word." So yeah, it is not necessary for you to have um, a degree in applied microbiology or medicine of whatever field to have an opinion on this because your body is being injected with this. So um, one of the things that I think is so difficult is getting good information, which I touched on before. But if you look at the vaccine schedules between when I was born in 1980 and what it is today, um, you have so many more of them today. And now it's a cocktail of multiple shots. You have MMR and you have diphtheria and you have tetanus and polio and just there's this entire cocktail that's not the same as it was a long time ago. And one of the things that if I could have this question answered would restore a lot of my trust. I blindly trusted the doctors when we had our kids, and my my youngest son Theodore had his shots, and then I like as they were doing it, I kind of wandered over in that exhausted dad haze that you get when you're in the hospital having children, and I picked up a piece of paper and looked at it, and it said hepatitis B, and I was like, why does my child need a Hep B vaccine? And because Hep B is an STD, like you can get it by sharing needles, for example, or by having scads of unprotected sex with dodgy characters. Okay. I don't think that my newborn baby is going to be in that category anytime soon. And so it's like, why do we need this? And, and the best answer I could get from the medical staff was, well, it's just required. It's just the thing we do. And I said, well, is the risk for this zero? I said, well, no. I said, okay, so can we do it later? It's like, well, no, it's in the cocktail. It's part of the cocktail. And so I just before just to show you this, I asked Google, why are babies given the hepatitis B vaccine? And here's what I got. It's to protect them from a serious lifelong liver infection that can lead to liver failure, liver cancer, and death. Infants are at high risk of contracting the virus from their mother during birth. And then it continues on. And it's like, well, unless the mother's negative, which they do test for, they give you like the blood screenings. One of the things that's included in there is a Hep B screening. And so the baby cannot possibly get hepatitis B from a mother who is negative. And so they could do this. Also, they're getting comped by the vaccine manufacturer, who incidentally has been legally insulated from being sued in case something goes wrong and you have a bad reaction. Our child ended up back in the hospital 2 days later with a 103-degree fever and had a spinal tap to rule out encephalitis and meningitis. And so it is, I do think that that was an adverse reaction to the first slew of vaccines that kids get. And if I never have to watch that entire process, like a newborn getting a spinal tap, that'd be great if I can never see that again. And so, color me skeptical with the entire thing. There are things that are not needed. And it does seem like it seems plausible, at least, that there's a profit motive behind this that's driving it.
Yeah, and with that of, people don't talk about the vaccine injuries. That's what it sounds like with your child. And there's definitely lots of COVID injuries or COVID vaccine injuries, and you can report those and just go through on VAERS, VAERS. But the thing is, like you pointed out, that the vaccine companies have made it so that they can't be sued for these injuries, and that makes we should be rightly suspect for those kinds of things. And your story reminded me of one of my daughters who's in the military, and in the military you have to have your flu vaccine. And I know the one time she was forced to get it is the one time she ended up in the hospital with the flu. She it, all the other times with all my girls and my wife, myself, never ended up in the hospital with the flu. And yet, the one time where I have a daughter that receives a vaccine for the flu, that's where she ends up. Uh, Josh, if you want to talk maybe about, the three of us read a paper by another pastor on this topic. Maybe if you want to inform people about maybe the danger of some of the ingredients in certain vaccines.
Well,
Oh, I'm sorry, Andy. I meant that one for Andy.
Well, I think Josh probably can speak to the ingredients a little bit better than I can, but I
Okay.
can speak to a couple things. I mean, Josh often talks, perhaps he's mentioned this on camera too, but off screen, he's often said to us, you know, pressure testing an argument is important. This isn't maybe the exact kind of analogy, but it would be fascinating, don't you think? Perhaps even culturally provocative for us to research and survey by research, research by surveying some a broad swath of American physicians. If we nutcases around glasses of alcohol, just riffing on subjects week to week, have a long list of anecdotes from our ministry and from our personal life experiences about vaccine injury and vaccine harm. What do you suppose the wide swath of American physicians have as anecdotes? Do you think they've never heard of patients reporting back, like clients reporting back that their kids or grandkids say have now come down with autism or have now come down with type 1 diabetes or have now come down with rheumatoid arthritis? Do you think they've never heard this before? I guarantee you they have. And, I'm not trying to condemn them writ large, but rather to say, like the Proverbs said, rescue those being led away to death. If you say, well, we knew nothing about this, does not he who weighs the heart perceive it? God knows what your motives are. And God knows whether it's money or some other rationale, whether you're sweeping things under the rug just to perpetuate the concocted system or some other kind of agenda. Uh, but then again, the minute we start talking about these kind of things, the only reason it's provocative is because of some of these cultural assumptions or lies that we have bought into.
Yeah, and kind of what I was getting at, and maybe you can touch on this then, Josh, is that again, we're encouraging everyone, don't take our word for it. Go and talk to your doctors, your physicians, but also do your own research that there are certain vaccines that are using aborted fetus cells and so forth for their research and for testing and so forth. And that should cause us not just problems. We should say, I think we can't use this. It's like, hey, I might get a really good deal on this vehicle. Hey, but it was stolen. Okay, do I really want to encourage? Maybe it's good stewardship on my part because now I'm saving all thousands of dollars on this vehicle, but I'm just going to encourage this guy to go and steal more vehicles and hurt other people. And so, if we are, I think, complicit in using medical technology that from the forbidden fruit of murdered babies, that's not something that we should be a part of. You want to touch on that, Josh?
sure. Well, it's a question of will your doctor tell you the truth reliably? Um, and I'll let you decide. I have a member of my family, my extended family, who is an ER doc. He's a triage physician, and I asked him about transgenderism, which is tangential to this because it's will your doctor tell you the truth? And he is not allowed to clarify a person's biological sex if they identify as male, for example, and they're a female, and for whatever reason it's hard to tell. Um, he said that this is really a problem for us because if you come into the ER presenting with abdominal pain, okay, the logic tree for men is very different than the logic tree for women because you can be pregnant if you're a woman, right? Abdominal pain, um, or you could have cervical cancer, or a whole bunch of other things. And so the treatment protocols are very different. So, for example, I wouldn't give an X-ray to a pregnant woman, but I would to a man who has random abdominal pain. Sure, why not? Right? And I said, why aren't you like, what happens if you ask? He's like, these are the protocols we're given. And if I violate them, there are serious consequences. I have a friend of mine who's an RN up in Oshkosh, and she said the exact same thing. I said, can you push back against that? She said, I'll lose my license immediately. And 2 years ago, we were looking for a new pediatrician because we moved and it was really far away. And we trusted the guy, and we ended up interviewing, which took a ton of time, 3 different pediatricians. And I ended the first consult with the same question. I said, I have to ask you a tough question here, doctor. Um, my son is 8 years old. If at the age of 14, he walks into your office and he says, I think I'm actually a girl, um, are you going to tell him the truth and disagree with him, or how would you handle that? And the, I mean, I don't think I have words to express how unbelievably uncomfortable each of those pediatricians were because they don't know if I'm like a berserker put there by whatever field would check this sort of thing. But they hemmed and hawed and said, I said, I'm asking you as a Christian, and would you tell me that this is happening, or would you just administer hormone treatments? They said, well, we would let you know, but we would begin treatment for that immediately. And so we ended up staying with our old physician because he at least he knew we weren't coming in to blindside him with a lawsuit from the hard left or whatever. And so it is very, very difficult to get a straight answer with things that have been politicized. And everyone should read about how traditional vaccines work apart from your doctor, because so there's different mechanisms for it. One of them is they take a viral sample and they heat it to the point where the protein structures denature or break down. A great example of denatured protein structures, if you watch an egg cooking on a griddle, it goes from a translucent, like the albumin goes, the egg white goes from a translucent liquid to an opaque solid. That's an example of a protein structure shifting and changing shape because of heat and its physical properties change. And so for a lot of viruses, if you damage them with heat, your body no longer recognizes them as a threat, but their basic structure is still there. And so what vaccine manufacturers will do is they will add something called an adjuvant. An adjuvant is an irritant to your immune system. It's something that's not supposed to be in your body. And so like aluminum salts are a common one that they'll use. And anything that's a foreign protein structure, which is called an antigen, that's in your body. So, for example, a whole bunch of denatured polio viruses or whatever. Your body goes, oh, hey, well, we're freaking out right now. Maybe it's this thing. And then they'll make antibodies for those things, which gives you immunity. The mRNA, mRNA vaccines are a completely different process than that. Both carry risk. But I would invite anyone listening to this to, for example, go and look at, and this is very important, children 0 to 18 without comorbidities, COVID fatality rate versus vaccine injury rates for the same age group without comorbidities. Um, I, I would argue that it's actually more dangerous to take the COVID vaccine for a child. If you have a healthy child who is not severely obese, diabetic, or extraordinarily asthmatic, your risk for dying from COVID is ostensibly zero. Your risk from the COVID vaccine is not zero. And the instance of myocarditis, which is the swelling of the pericardium or the sac that surrounds the heart, especially in young men, um, ages 0 through 24, is significantly higher than the death rate for COVID. And so, despite this, um, I was told to get a COVID shot. I declined that. I did get the Moderna vaccine because we had to back in the day. And my prayer is that that didn't do damage that I can't undo. And our children have not, though, nor will they get that vaccine because of those those risks.
Josh, why did you have to? Because of the school or because of what pressure?
There was a lot of pressure from school. In particular, um, there was a side event where it was absolutely required, and that's kind of a sidebar. It was a field trip I really needed to go on, and it was required to travel. And so I thought, all right, well, here we are. Um, and
That's what
so,
I take issue with, though, a lot is just to key off that last point you were making as well. Just think of all the people whose consciences were burdened by pressure to do something with regard to the COVID vaccine alone. But now add to that all the consciences that are afflicted by doctors who, for whatever reason, be it money or a different agenda, are pressuring their patients to put into their body something that their body may or may not actually benefit from.
Yeah.
So this really does
yeah,
overlap into the spiritual realm quite significantly.
Yeah. So let's touch on the conscience that I remember we had a special worship service back when I was in Racine at our local area Lutheran high school. And because this is what I do, I took pictures and posted them on Facebook because it was a big deal because our two congregations in Racine had voted to merge. And and so we were celebrating that. And then the principal called me a week later and said that he had fielded all kinds of calls from the Federation saying, "Hey, we saw Pastor Zarling. He was in your school without a mask." This was in November of 2020 and they were requiring everyone to wear masks. Well, I didn't require anyone to wear masks. If they wanted to, they could, but I didn't force it on anyone. And so he was wondering how I could get away with it and our people could get away with it when that was kind of the rule. And I said, well, because wearing a mask goes against my conscience. And he said, I never heard that before. So I quoted this to him, and I use this in my book too. Is on page 137 of Resisting the Dragon's Beast. Paul writes, I'll just quote it here. The Apostle Paul has some very strong words for causing people to sin against their conscience. He says in 1 Corinthians 8:12, and when you sin in this way against your brothers and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. And I quoted Luther uh, at the Diet of Worms. Uh, to go against conscience is neither right nor safe. That when we say this goes against my conscience to wear a mask or to be socially distanced, to not be with my grandmother in the hospital because she's dying, to have a vaccine, or to have my kids have a vaccine, and people are telling me, no, you have to do this. That goes against my conscience. And Paul says that you are sinning against Christ to make someone do something they feel is wrong. And The sad thing is, most Christians, maybe most of us as Lutherans, don't understand sinning against the conscience. Uh, and if you want to touch on this part, maybe to
Yeah,
where, uh, again, whether it's going back to COVID with masks or whether it's with vaccines, it's kind of the same thing, where people will use verses like this from, was it Philippians 2, verse 4. Paul writes, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others, or where people will say, well, love your neighbor as yourself. Therefore, do this. How can they use these as these beautiful commands to love as a club or as a cudgel?
sure. The thing I want to do first
Mhm.
is let people know that we'll link to a very well-written paper by a brother pastor of ours named Matt Hennig called "The Lord is My Light and My Salvation, of whom shall I be afraid?" Examining mandatory vaccinations in the light of Scripture and with the confidence of faith, which speaks to this issue directly. What he'll say in the paper and what I would amplify full throated is that at face value, that seems like a very powerful argument, unless because of independent research, your conscience, perhaps even access to friends and um, people of our fellowship, like Josh has, who are in that field, whether they be doctors, nurses, family members, friends, whatever. If you've come to a different conviction, which is now guiding your conscience, since a lot of these things are not black and white spelled out in the scriptures. As one example, Pastor Hennig talks about those who might choose not to vaccinate because of not the methodology with which the vaccines are generated, but the morality behind them, or what we might call the immorality. Moreover, there might be a broader audience of your consideration for loving your neighbor in regard to your personal medical decision than just those that people try to guilt trip you into considering when it comes to vaccines. So, for example, during COVID, had someone near and dear to us approach me and say, aren't you going to tell people to wear their mask, or aren't you going to tell people to be vaccinated? And I said something similar to what you said, Mike, that I'm going to allow people to use their sanctified reason and then exercise that reason in their own decision for how to manage their own body and welfare and well-being, their health, even in relation to their neighbor, because there might be considerations for neighbors that we can't even consider or that we're not even aware of. So, for example, this person said to me, "Well, don't you care if my daughter dies?" And I said, "Well, I don't remember exactly what I said. I think I used the analogy about it's not my job to go giving double parkers parking tickets either when I see that happening downtown. But I said something to the effect of, well, how do you know that the person who's not taking the vaccine has some consideration in mind for the elderly or for children in a different stand in a different place that they're taking into consideration for their own decision?" So the point being that it is so convenient and easy to cherry pick Bible passages in an additional, like, pseudo spiritual sounding way as though to burden consciences again. This calls for careful discernment on the part of the saints, which echoes a sentiment by John in Revelation. But if I could just share a couple of things in that regard as well, like, for example, we often talk about, based on Romans chapter 1, the natural order of things when it specifically has to do with human sexuality. But we might want to begin in regard to this subject matter, talking about God's natural order of things in terms of broader human biology, because the systems that God set in place for our well-being on planet Earth aren't just like gravitational systems or, uh, you know, um, human sexuality issues. The natural order of things is broader than that. I'll give you one convenient example for myself. The way a scab heals in your body is a natural system that God set up, or the way a mother's milk nurtures a baby. But you might remember, especially in the late 70s and early 80s, the big pressure from the institutional hospital systems was you got to use baby formula, you got to use baby formula, you got to use baby formula. When in fact, if Christian mothers were really sort of being discerning, they might have considered whether there's, whether God's natural order of things might be more beneficial if and wherever possible. And I'm not trying to guilt mothers who didn't do that, but rather simply to say, if you have a clear-cut option between affording God's systems to work the way they were intended, or to use an artificial system or a human concoction, you might consider whether it's more beneficial to use God's natural systems instead.
Yeah, and on that, again, why can we as pastors and a teacher talk about this? Because there are spiritual implications that, again, going back to COVID, there were churches that I went into, some of our own Wisconsin and Lutheran churches that had signs up that said that you needed to wear a mask or you couldn't worship there. Okay. There were some, again, my book came out still in the height of 2021 with COVID and everything. And I think I got some, some pushback by some pastors because they had forced people to wear masks and so forth. And maybe they were feeling guilty and so forth. And I argued when I presented the first 5 chapters of my book to my pastor's conference that wearing a mask is a medical device. And so then by telling people you have to wear a mask, then you are telling people what to do medically. And they said, no, it's just a piece of cloth. I said, you can't have it both ways, brothers. Okay. It's either a medical device and you're telling people to do this, or it's just a worthless piece of cloth. Okay. You decide. Uh, Again, on social media, when the COVID vaccine came out, there were brothers that were discussing this of whether they should encourage, maybe even force their members to have this vaccine. And again, they used it out of love. But now, uh, all these years later, and I have this documented in my book too, and all you have to do is go to VAERS.com and to see all of the countless injuries from that specific COVID vaccine. Uh, and going back to what Josh had said earlier about how all of these vaccines have become political, I remember going and visiting one of our homebound members after the vaccine for COVID had come out, and the daughter who was taking care of her elderly mother just politely asked, "Well, did you get your COVID vaccine?" And I said, "I don't talk about those kind of things because it's become political. But if you want to talk about my colonoscopy, we can." And then she said, "No, that's fine." Uh, but it was uh and I wanted to have that humor there to say, hey, this is something personal. We shouldn't be talking about this, but not only were everyone talking about it, but we were mandating it. So Josh, go ahead and riff on anything that Andy and I were talking about there.
Well, sure. So, my go-to mask when it was like gun to your head, as it were, and you had to, was I found a woodworking mask that, um, if you'll forgive me, it looked like negligee, like like a lacy brassiere cup. And if you held it up to the light, you could see right through it. It did literally nothing to filter anything, but it looked like a mask. And so, okay. Um, because I like, you're to have a piece of cloth in front of you, a piece of cotton, you're breathing in then like a bacterial colony. And I can recall I got into Menards once, and the security guy, who was armed, was otherwise occupied with people who didn't want to wear masks. So I just kind of scooted in behind him. And I was in the hardware section looking for wood screws or something. And he approached me, mask on, and said, "Put a mask on or leave." And I looked this guy over and I thought, oh, okay, well, I'm really curious. And so I asked him, I said, I noticed it's your arm. Like, are you telling me with lethal force behind the order that I had to comply with this? And he's like, you'll be trespassed and then we can use force. I'm like, are you serious? Like this is a rent-a-cop, right? This is not like a like badged law enforcement. You had people who were willing to go to life and death over that because it became that polarizing that quickly. Um, in that period of time where we had lots of extra time, I got a hold of the entire set of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago. If you've not read this book, you definitely should. I feel like I'm hawking books on the end of this podcast. Um, every high school kid should read this book because you will be quickly disabused of any notion that socialism is a good thing or communism is a good thing. But when I first read this, one of the questions that I had is, how did the neighbor guys rat each other out? And the people who were in prison rat each, I didn't understand. And then COVID happened. And then
And
you
now you
had
know.
Hmm.
it, it's like, and what is that thing? I think I heard a speech Jordan Peterson did where he was talking about how these people would sell you out for 30 seconds of self-satisfaction or self-importance. Um, and so that's one component. Ask me your question one more time because I had one more point that just evaporated in my mind here.
Yeah, I had just talked about, riffing on this, but maybe while you're trying to remember that too, what you were talking about earlier about, physicians. A lot
Yeah.
of times you're going to hear people say things like the science is settled. Well, Josh, you're the science teacher among us. You can talk about that, about science being settled. From what I understand with science, yeah, it's never settled. I I don't know about you, Andy. I took more language classes and religion classes in high school, and I didn't have as many science classes. So, uh, and yet, if you talk to physicians, and I've had members who are doctors and nurses, but I've had a lot more members who have ended up in the hospital with doctors and nurses. And here's the thing with whenever you go in the hospital, what's the most frustrating thing? They don't know what's wrong with you. Or they're testing this thing, or then they're testing this thing, and then they're testing this thing to see what works. Why? Because the science isn't settled. And to say that one thing is going to be able to cure it for every single person, uh, I don't think that's accurate. There's a lot of guesswork in there,
Well,
and
Mike, it's either
yeah,
that or all the DEI hires at the hospital.
yeah,
Mike, can I come back?
yes,
Okay. Um, speaking of things that are highly politicized, I sent you a link um, to a YouTube video just before we went on. Ivermectin.
yes.
Ivermectin has a robust um, history of fighting a variety of things as an antiparasitic. It won the Nobel Prize in 2015, and it was found to be a demonstrably effective antiviral against COVID-19. And the reason that it was discarded as a treatment option is because I think Trump suggested it, and Trump equals bad for many people, and so it was just a no. And also the more darkly cynical part of me says, well, ivermectin, the patent's expired on that. And so you can make it for about 15 cents per pill. So there's no money involved in that. Whereas like the new antivirals they came out with were insanely expensive because they were patented. And so again, you have and I'm largely a capitalist, but like that was just evil what they did. How many people would have been saved had they been administered ivermectin early on in the treatment course? And for a while, it was banned. You couldn't get it. Like I asked said member of my family who is a physician, I'm like, hey, um, I just came back from Panama and I had mosquitoes bite me. I think I might have um, dengue fever. Is it possible for me to get some ivermectin? And he's like, nice try. I'm sorry, I can't. I'm like, I'll lose my license. Why? So we're not allowed to prescribe it right now.
Mhm.
Seriously? Like, I it
Tell
was
me,
just
tell me there's no underlying agenda without telling me there's no underlying agenda.
Yeah.
yeah.
And with that, going back to COVID, what were people saying we needed with COVID? We needed vitamin D and we needed some sunshine. And what they do, they locked us up. We needed exercise because it was those with comorbidities that were the ones that were more susceptible to this disease. And what do we do? They locked us up and we just watched our binge watch Netflix and then we had DoorDash and everything. We got lazier and fatter and more susceptible to a disease.
By
Uh,
the way,
yeah.
with that, we talk about essential services. Okay. Um, you had all these things shut down that were deemed non-essential. Okay. Notice church was in that category. What was in the essential category? Liquor
Gambling,
stores, grocery stores, gambling. Um, the I noticed. Okay, so I go to Living Hope,
NFL football.
which is
Well,
yeah,
after a while,
Yeah.
right. There's a shop that sells pornography. It is adjacent to the church that I attend. It's called Temptations, ironically, or unironically, I guess. That was open, so like you could go into the porn shop, but you couldn't go to church. And all the liquor stores and all the bars um and so that entire thing was absolutely nonsensical. And the fact that church was outlawed is it's just an indicator that you have to ask questions and not just blindly trust quote unquote the experts.
Yeah, and then with that too is again, if you're paying attention to modern medicine, a lot of times people will say they're really not there to heal you. They kind of get you hooked on certain things and then to keep you coming back because that's where the money is. And if you question that, all you have to do is look again at the COVID-19 vaccine that said you take this, you'll be healed. Except that you get set up for, say, your 6 month boosters and so forth. Okay, because they keep coming back. Uh, one more thing before we close here, and again, pastorally, and if you want to touch on this, this is, I think this fits again with COVID, but it fits also with the whole reaction to vaccines is fear. That I think people like to wear fear as a badge of honor. I don't know if you guys are Star Wars fans, but I'm going to quote Yoda here. Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. And yet, people were saying, well, we were so afraid. So we can just, what happens when we are afraid? Well, we hand more things over to the government. We're afraid, and so uh, we'll allow we'll give up freedoms so we have more security. So maybe if you want to touch on pastorally that whole sin of fear, Andy.
well, sure. Think about the Gospels, where how often Jesus says, or frankly, throughout the scriptures, how often when a divine being like an angel, or even where a pre-incarnate Christ appearance takes place, and what are the first words out of the mouth of the angel or of the angel of the Lord or of God Himself? Do not be afraid. In the Gospels, how many times does Jesus say, don't be afraid, don't be afraid? Fear is the enemy of faith, and Jesus promises certainly drive out fear. So we want to minimize those. But if I could sort of hijack this thread of conversation and in sort of my closing comments, make a couple of interconnected but also tangential points. So on the one hand, another reason why I think it's important to talk about these things, because even we fall into the trap of of shotgun responses, right? Or quick trigger responses to things. pithy but unthinking responses, especially when it comes to member inquiries or student inquiries about health matters. We want to be a little more well informed and not use the cliches of our day so that we demonstrate by our ignorance a lack of spiritual aptitude and understanding when we try to apply scripture to the decision or help Christians apply scripture and use it in their decision making process for stewardship of their body. Also, I I realize that this can sound hyperbolic, but I want to ask this with as much authentic sincerity as I can. Is it any wonder that shortly, well, in some cases during COVID, at the tail end of COVID, and then shortly thereafter, at the tail end of COVID, you had a lot of authoritarian maneuvers that abruptly took place in Australia. Shortly after COVID, within a year or two afterwards, you have now, we're in the midst of it. England, it's not just an immigration thing with Islam in England. It's neighbor ratting neighbor out for social media posts. Well, where did they do the test run for that kind of social behavior? And if you don't think that those threats loom with regard to not just our health, but our morality, supposedly, like it's immoral for you to repost a meme on Facebook. And so the government says they're going to knock on your door and arrest you. And so, like your Paul Blart example there, Joshua, at your local Menards, um, did you ever did you ever circle back and apologize once COVID was over and say, "Boy, did I blow that out of proportion. Sorry, my friend." Of course not. And neither will any authority figures because people are shallow about these matters. And like you said with Jordan Peterson, to sell people out for 30 seconds of self satisfaction, they'll just, they'll do that to you. Guess what? That day is probably coming because we too have been in the the beaker, so to speak, or the petri dish of experimentation here in America. And that's, I guess, where I'll close on this is that, if our government or world governments in general can take control of individual healthcare and individual healthcare decisions, even the most uh, even the most essential of them, like life and death, if the government can coerce and dictate and determine and redefine morality, if they take carte blanche or full control over education, then what does the beast of the sea become? The false god it has always intended to be. And so, at the root of this discussion and some of these cautions that we're issuing and some of these anecdotes that we're sharing is an urging for people not just to be discerning, but to discern what is of God and what is of the false God, that is the beast of the sea, the beast coming out of the sea, human authorities.
Right. Because whenever you're giving that autonomy of your body over to something or someone else, that is not good stewardship. Uh, you're not trusting in your body that God has made wonderfully. I'm wondering too, uh, again, this is just me, that with the more vaccines that we've had since when I was little to now where, my granddaughter is in the hospital and so forth, just being born a few months ago, that uh, children, if you notice, they're sicker. We as adults are sicker. I, is that causation? Is it correlation? That's for everyone else to understand. But again, the reason we're talking about this, we have to have stewardship of our bodies that we're giving over to other people because it's so much easier to get a shot, to get a pill, than it is to actually do the hard work, eat healthy, exercise, and so forth. What do you want to say, Josh, in wrapping everything up?
Well, to kind of riff on Andy's point there, I think we need to be weary of false dichotomies of legalism when we have these edicts come down from on high. Like Romans 13 tells us to submit to the governing authorities, but there are limits on that. And the notion, even among brothers or sisters in Christ, of the we have to do something. We have to do something. This is something, and so we have to do this. Or you're not loving, or you're not being faithful. Um, those are false dichotomies. What happened in Australia and in the UK in particular is, if you recall, in Australia they had this app. You were required to carry around your cell phone or mobile device, and you had to have your GPS and location enabled, and you were not allowed to be more than 15 minutes from wherever you lived, which that's your 15-minute city. Topic for the future, by the way. Um, and so, yeah, that was a dry run for social engineering that's going to be coming forward, and the totalitarian state that follows. And so, as we're coming off of Thanksgiving, I think it's important to just take stock of the blessings that we have. Um, I've been reading through the book of Psalms with my chemistry students. I just opened class with one of the Psalms, whichever one we're on, reading them in sequence. We're on Psalm 56 right now. And it's been so good because I have 6 sections of students. And so I read each one of these Psalms 6 times, and it's been so beneficial. And you get into some of the more despair-laden Psalms of David, and you really start to appreciate like what we have living in this place in this time. And it's very easy um, to have the spirit of the age despoil that with fear of what's going to happen next with AI or with Islam or with whatever. And so, but as we come out of Thanksgiving weekend, my goodness, be thankful for the incredible freedom and blessings that we have here. If you're living in the US, if you're hearing this podcast somehow in the United Kingdom, my prayers are with you, I guess.
Yeah, and I'm going to share a number of resources on my Facebook page, Resisting the Dragon's Beast, so you can follow there. One of them is something I shared a few weeks ago after my wife Shelley and I listened to it. There's a lot of distances between cities in Wyoming. Since there's only 18 cities in the entire state, it takes a while to drive between them. And so we listened to long podcasts, and one was Mike Rowe, who has a podcast called The Way I Heard It. And he has hour and 15-minute podcast. This one was even longer than that. But I'll share it with you because the guest he has on was what you would call a vaccine skeptic. Well, he says there's one vaccine he trusts and is good for. The others he has, again, he's not a doctor. He doesn't have he's not a physician, and yet he's done the research on it way more than anyone else I know has. So I would encourage you to listen to that. And then I'll try and get permission from Pastor Hennig to share the link for his paper. And then I'll also share some of these pithy responses, but these are thinking responses, Andy. These memes I found. Imagine watching your country get sicker, weaker, and more infertile by the year. Then watching politicians attack the only guy asking what the heck is going on. That's where we are. And then one more. No one argues that Tylenol, penicillin, and other medications cause reactions and even death. But the second it's a vaccine, suddenly it's sprinkled with fairy dust and unicorn farts. Toxic ingredients magically sold as healthy for every human alive. And if you question it, you're branded a science denier. That's not logic. That's indoctrination. And that's kind of what we're just talking about here is just study these things. So, uh, Andy, do you have any kind of news sources, whether it's just news sources or things on this topic of vaccines that you think that people should read up on?
Well, if we get permission from Pastor Hennig about posting his paper, you'll find a lot of good links within his paper. One other thoughtful email subscription I've I've reviewed from time to time. I get the email pretty much daily, but I don't read it every day, admittedly. And it is, of course, right leaning. You would expect that. But I find some of their articles to be sensible and thoughtful. But that's called the Patriot Post. So the Patriot Post has been a pretty sound email subscription for the most part.
All right. Then we'll close with this Bible verse, and this is how Pastor Hennig closed his paper with Proverbs 24, verses 11 and 12. Rescue those being led away to death. Hold back those staggering toward slaughter. If you say, but we knew nothing about this, does not he who weighs the heart perceive it? Lord's blessings, and we'll see you next week.